My parents skipped my doctorate ceremony for my brother's backyard barbecue. When I called them from the empty auditorium, my mother simply said they had already eaten, and my father told me to stop being so dramatic. I did not cry. Instead, I changed my identity, vanished forever, and planned an ultimate payoff that would leave them completely speechless. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Chloe, 33 years old, and standing alone in a sea of empty folding chairs. The graduation march had long stopped playing. The vast auditorium, which just an hour ago was filled with 2,000 cheering parents and proud families, was now echoing with the sound of janitors sweeping up dropped programs and confetti. I stood there in my heavy velvet doctoral gown, holding the leather-bound folder that represented 8 years of sleepless nights, grueling research, and quantitative finance exams. Other graduates were outside taking photos with bouquets of flowers and balloons. I had nothing but the echoing silence of the hall. My phone felt heavy in my hand. I stared at the blank screen, willing it to light up with a missed call or a text message. Nothing. I took a deep breath, smoothed out the velvet sleeves of my gown, and dialed my mother's number. It rang 4 times before she finally answered. Through the receiver, I could hear the loud thumping of top 40 music, the clinking of beer bottles, and the shrill laugh of my white sister-in-law, Chelsea. "Hello," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Mom, the ceremony ended 20 minutes ago. Are you and Dad on your way to the campus?" Brenda sighed loudly directly into the microphone of her phone. "Oh, Chloe, your ceremony is over already. I thought it was just them handing out a piece of paper anyway. We are at Marcus and Chelsea's house. They are hosting a barbecue to celebrate the 3-month anniversary of adopting their new corgi puppy. You know how important this milestone is for them. They have been trying to build a family." I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers to the bridge of my nose. A dog party. My mother chose a party for a dog over watching her only daughter receive a doctorate. "Mom, we talked about this for 6 months," I said, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "I reserved premium seats for you." "We already ate, Chloe." My mother snapped back, her tone dripping with annoyance. "We could not just leave Marcus hanging. He is launching his new startup next week and needs all the family support he can get. Your brother is building a real legacy. A degree does not put cash in your pocket today. Just catch a ride back to the house. There is no food left here anyway, so grab something on your way." Before I could respond, I heard the phone shuffle and my father's voice came through the line. "Chloe, listen to your mother," he grumbled over the background noise. "Stop being so dramatic and ruining the mood. Your brother is under a lot of pressure right now with his business. You should be happy for him instead of making everything about yourself. A piece of paper does not make you better than us. Just get an Uber, and we will see you when we get home." The line went dead. He hung up on me. I stood completely frozen as the dial tone buzzed in my ear. For my entire life, I had played by their rules. I got the perfect grades, I stayed out of trouble, and I worked myself to the bone, hoping that one day they would look at me with the same pride they reserved for my brother Marcus. Marcus who dropped out of college, Marcus who constantly borrowed money, Marcus who always needed saving. In that echoing auditorium, a profound shift happened inside me. The desperation for their approval withered and died completely. I did not shed a single tear. The sadness was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I took off the heavy velvet gown, folded it neatly over my arm, and walked out of the double doors into the bright afternoon sun. I pulled out my phone, opened a ride-sharing app, and typed in the address to my parents' house. I was not returning to beg for their love. I was going back to pack my bags, take back my life, and erase them from my future entirely. They wanted a barbecue. I was going to give them a fire they would never forget. The ride to my parents' house was quiet. I stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood roll by. When the Uber pulled into the driveway, I noticed my brother's silver SUV parked out front. They had moved the barbecue after party to my parents' large backyard. I could hear the faint sound of music and laughter coming from behind the house. I ignored it. I walked through the front door and headed straight for my bedroom on the second floor. I pulled two large suitcases from my closet and began throwing my clothes and essentials inside. I did not care about folding anything. I just wanted to be gone. As I was zipping up the first bag, I heard footsteps in the hallway. The door creaked open and Chelsea leaned against the doorframe. She was holding a plastic cup of wine and wearing a floral sundress that looked entirely too expensive for someone whose husband had been unemployed for 8 months. But what caught my eye and made my blood run instantly cold was the jewelry resting against her collarbone. It was my grandmother's vintage gold and emerald necklace. The one my grandmother explicitly told my mother to give to me on the day I earned my doctorate. Chelsea took a sip of her wine and smiled a tight, condescending smile. "Well, if it is not the new graduate," she said. "Marcus told me you were throwing a fit about us missing your little school ceremony. Honestly, Chloe, you should be proud of yourself. It is so impressive how articulate you are and how you managed to get through such a tough program. I know those diversity quotas really help open doors, but you still had to do the work right. Good for you." I stared at the necklace, ignoring her thinly veiled racism. "Take that necklace off, Chelsea," I said. My voice was dangerously low. "That belongs to me. Grandma promised it to me for my graduation." Chelsea scoffed and reached up to touch the emerald pendant, playing with it intentionally. "Oh, this old thing," she laughed. "Brenda gave it to me this morning. She said it looked much better with my skin tone anyway. Besides, you are not really the type to wear fine jewelry, are you? You are always so focused on your books and your spreadsheets." Before I could take a step toward her, my mother appeared in the doorway, standing right behind Chelsea. She had a plate of ribs in her hand and a scowl on her face. "Stop harassing your sister-in-law, Chloe," my mother snapped. "I gave her the necklace because she is actually building a family with Marcus. She appreciates family heirlooms. You just want to hoard things for yourself." I looked at my mother, feeling a profound sense of disgust. "You gave her my inheritance on the exact day you decided to skip my graduation," I asked. "You do not need inheritance," my mother fired back, stepping into the room. "You have your little degree now. In fact, we need to talk about that. Marcus is launching his new tech startup next month. He needs seed money. Now that you are done wasting time in school, you need to get a real job and start contributing. We expect you to transfer at least $10,000 to his business account by next Friday. It is the least you can do after living under our roof all these years. He is the man of the family and he is going to make us wealthy. You need to support his dream." I looked at the two women standing in my childhood bedroom. One was a parasite wearing my grandmother's legacy. The other was the woman who gave birth to me but never actually loved me. They looked so smug. They genuinely believed I would simply bow my head, open my bank account, and hand over my hard-earned savings to fund my brother's delusions. They thought I was weak. I did not argue. I did not scream. I did not demand the necklace back. The emerald was beautiful, but it was tied to a family I no longer wanted any part of. Let Chelsea keep the trinket. It would be the only valuable thing she would ever own once I was finished with them. I zipped up my second suitcase and grabbed the handles. I walked right past them, forcing Chelsea to step aside. I went downstairs and walked into the kitchen. I took my key off my keychain and placed it gently on the marble island. The metallic clink echoed in the quiet room. I walked out the front door and loaded my bags into the waiting car. As the driver left, I blocked all their numbers. The ride to the airport was the first time I truly felt the weight of my decision. I was not just moving out, I was erasing myself from their world completely. I walked up to the airline counter and bought the next available one-way ticket to New York. I had no apartment waiting for me and no job lined up, but I had my laptop, my suitcases, and a bank account I had been secretly building for years. The moment the plane wheels lifted off the tarmac, I felt a physical release in my chest. But disappearing in the modern world requires more than just a plane ticket. It requires a meticulous unwinding of your entire life. My first morning in New York was spent entirely in a bank branch. Since I was a teenager, my mother had her name on my primary savings account. She called it an emergency measure, but I knew it was just another way to monitor me. I sat across from a bewildered bank manager and instructed him to drain every single cent from that account and close it permanently. He asked if I was sure, warning me that my mother would receive a notification. I told him I was absolutely sure. By the time my mother realized the money she planned to steal for Marcus was gone, I was already sitting in a law office taking the next crucial step. I hired an attorney to expedite a legal name change. I did not want to leave any breadcrumbs for my family to follow when my brother inevitably drove his business into the ground and came looking for my money. The legal process took several weeks of filing paperwork, appearing before a judge, and updating my Social Security information. When the final decree was handed to me, I walked out of the courthouse as Dr. Chloe Davenport. I threw my old driver's license into a street corner trash can. My new name felt like armor. It was sharp, professional, and completely untethered from the people who saw me as nothing more than a stepping stone for their golden child. Armed with a new identity and a freshly printed resume highlighting my doctorate in quantitative finance, I threw myself into the brutal corporate world of Manhattan. I targeted venture capital firms that were known for being ruthless. I did not want a warm work family. I wanted a place that measured worth in cold, hard numbers. During my interviews, I leveraged my deep understanding of predictive risk analysis and mathematical modeling. The partners at the top-tier firm I selected were stunned by my aggressive strategies. They offered me a position on the spot. I accepted and quickly became the most feared associate in the building. While my coworkers spent their weekends partying, I worked 90-hour weeks. I built algorithms that identified failing startups before they crashed and negotiated buyouts that brought millions into the firm. My drive was no longer fueled by a desperate need for my parents' approval. It was fueled by a promise I made to myself to become so incredibly powerful that no one could ever diminish my worth again. I climbed the corporate ladder with a speed that left older executives breathless. I learned how to smell desperation in business pitches and how to dismantle arrogant founders who reminded me of my brother. My bonuses grew from 5 figures to 6 and then to 7. I lived quietly despite my growing wealth. I bought a luxury penthouse overlooking the city skyline, but kept my public profile completely invisible. I stayed off all social media platforms. I attended high-profile industry galas, but never allowed my photograph to be published in business journals. To the outside world, Dr. Chloe Davenport was a ghost who only existed in boardroom whispers and massive wire transfers. I used my wealth to systematically build an ironclad fortress around my life. 5 years passed in a flash of late nights and highly lucrative business deals. The painful memories of that empty graduation auditorium and the stolen emerald necklace faded into the background of my new reality. By my 33rd birthday, I had stepped down from my executive position at the firm to launch my own private equity group. I named it Apex Holdings. I was the sole owner and the anonymous head of an empire that controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in assets. I operated completely in the shadows, letting my elite team be the public face of the business, while I carefully pulled the strings from high above. I had completely won the game. I was untouchable. But the universe has a funny way of bringing the past back to your doorstep just when you think you have locked all the doors. It was a very cold and remarkably rainy early Tuesday morning in Manhattan when my secure private email server chimed with a highly encrypted message. I was sitting comfortably at my massive mahogany desk, sipping black coffee and reviewing a complex corporate merger agreement. The email was from David, the private investigator I had kept on a generous retainer for the past 5 years. Hiring him was never about lingering emotional attachment. It was a calculated risk management strategy. I needed to ensure my toxic family never found out where I lived or attempted to disrupt the empire I was building. Up until now, his quarterly updates had been completely and delightfully boring. My parents were getting older, my brother was still talking a big game, and Chelsea was still insufferable. But this morning's report was flagged with a high priority. I clicked the attachment and began to read through the 70-page financial dossier. The first domino in my brother's carefully constructed house of cards was finally tipping over. According to the deeply researched documents, Marcus was in severe financial trouble. His highly praised tech startup was nothing more than a glorified shell game. For 5 years, he had been stringing along small-time investors, mostly gullible friends of my parents and naive local business owners. He used their seed money to rent a flashy downtown office space and buy expensive catered lunches. But he had zero actual products in development. He had zero patents and absolutely zero revenue. He was simply paying himself a massive executive salary out of the investment pool while the business slowly bled to death. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, fueled entirely by his massive ego. But the well had officially run dry. The initial investors were starting to ask hard questions about their returns, and Marcus was running out of excuses. As if his business failures were not enough, Chelsea was accelerating their financial ruin at record speed. David had attached several pages of credit reports and bank statements. Chelsea was absolutely terrified of losing her status among the wealthy housewives in their affluent suburb. To maintain the illusion of an elite lifestyle, she was burning through high-interest credit cards like wildfire. She was leasing a brand-new luxury SUV every 2 years, buying designer handbags and spending thousands of dollars at premium dog groomers for that ridiculous corgi. She even hired a personal stylist. The investigative report included photographs of her carrying shopping bags out of high-end boutiques, while collections notices literally piled up inside her mailbox. They were drowning in hundreds of thousands of dollars of unsecured consumer debt. Their credit scores were completely obliterated. No legitimate bank would ever lend them another dime. The most pathetic part of the report was the section detailing my parents' current situation. Brenda and Derek remained blissfully ignorant or perhaps intentionally blind to the massive financial crater Marcus had dug for himself. David noted that my mother still hosted weekly luncheons where she endlessly bragged about her wealthy CEO son. She showed off the cheap gifts Chelsea bought her, using maxed-out credit cards, completely unaware that she was celebrating a mirage. My father was already looking into early retirement options, firmly believing Marcus would step up and fund their golden years. They honestly thought their golden child had won the lottery of life. They had no idea he was currently dodging phone calls from aggressive debt collectors. I sat firmly back in my leather chair. I felt absolutely no pity for any of them. They had built their entire identity around Marcus being the superior child. They had sacrificed my graduation, my inheritance, and my emotional well-being to worship at the altar of his potential. Now that potential was revealed to be a massive toxic sinkhole. But Marcus was a survivor in the worst sense of the word. Like a parasite, he would not simply die off quietly when his host ran out of nutrients. He would just find a larger host to consume. I scrolled down to the final paragraph of the investigator's report, and my eyes instantly narrowed. David noted that Marcus had recently visited the county clerk's office. He had pulled the official property records and the original deed for my parents' house. It was a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial home that my father had spent 30 years paying off. It was the only tangible asset left in our entire family lineage. Unencumbered and full of equity, Marcus had maxed out his credit, he had drained his investors, and he had ruined his wife. Now he was turning his greedy eyes toward his parents' only remaining lifeline. The parasite was preparing to strike the heart and drain the last drop of blood from his own family. The audio files David sent later that week were crystal clear. He had managed to place a legal recording device near the open patio window of my parents' house during one of their Sunday dinners. I sat in my office listening to the exact moment Marcus initiated his most despicable con yet. I could hear the clinking of silverware and the soft hum of the backyard fountain. Marcus waited until my mother served dessert before launching into his carefully rehearsed performance. He did not ask for money directly. Instead, he started sighing heavily, rubbing his temples and picking at his food. Naturally, my mother took the bait immediately, asking her golden child what was wrong. Marcus claimed his tech company was on the absolute brink of a massive buyout from a major Silicon Valley firm. He used big words and vague corporate jargon that he knew my parents would never actually understand. But then came the pivot. He told them his lead investor had suddenly frozen their assets due to an IRS audit, and he needed a temporary bridge loan to keep the servers running for just 3 more months. If he missed payroll, the buyout would collapse. It was a masterful performance of manipulation. I listened to his voice crack as he told my mother he was terrified of failing her. He even managed to squeeze out a few fake tears. Derek, my father, finally spoke up, asking how much this bridge loan would need to be. When Marcus dropped the number $400,000, the patio went dead silent. My father stuttered, saying they only had their pension and Social Security. But Marcus was fully prepared for that hesitation. He smoothly suggested taking out a massive home equity loan on the house. He promised he would pay it back double within 6 months once the tech buyout was finalized. Derek tried to inject some logic, gently reminding Marcus that the house was their only safety net for retirement. But Brenda, my mother, instantly shut my father down. I could hear the venom in her voice as she declared that family must sacrifice for each other. Brenda slammed her hand on the table and loudly proclaimed that Marcus was the true legacy of their family. She said he was the only one trying to build generational wealth, unlike that ungrateful daughter who abandoned them over a silly little graduation party. She told Marcus she would go to the bank the very next morning to sign whatever paperwork he needed. She reassured him that she believed in his vision completely. Derek, beaten down by decades of my mother's domineering personality, simply surrendered and agreed. Listening to the recording, I felt a twisted sense of validation. My mother was willing to gamble the roof over her head for a son who lied to her face, but she could not be bothered to attend my doctoral ceremony. She was handing him the loaded gun he would use to destroy their lives. True to her word, Brenda marched into a local bank that Monday and leveraged the entire equity of their colonial home. The bank transferred $400,000 directly into Marcus and Chelsea's joint checking account. David tracked the flow of those funds over the next 4 months, and the financial hemorrhage was spectacular to witness. Marcus did not put a single dime into his failing business. Instead, he immediately paid off 2 aggressive loan sharks who had been threatening him. He then dumped a massive chunk of cash into an incredibly risky cryptocurrency scheme, hoping to magically double the money overnight. He lost every penny of that investment in 3 weeks. Meanwhile, Chelsea saw the massive account balance and completely lost her mind. Assuming they were finally rich, she went on an unhinged spending spree. She booked a luxury 2-week vacation to Bora Bora, flying first class and staying in a private overwater bungalow. She bought designer watches, completely remodeled their kitchen with imported Italian marble, and threw lavish catered parties for her superficial friends. By the end of the 4th month, the $400,000 had completely vanished into thin air. The account balance hit 0. The problem with massive home equity loans is that the monthly repayment amounts are staggering. With the cash gone and no real income, Marcus simply stopped paying the bank. At first, he ignored the polite reminder emails, then he ignored the phone calls. But banks do not play games when it comes to their collateral. Soon, the heavy envelopes stamped with bright red urgent lettering began arriving in my parents' mailbox. The bank was demanding payment and warning of severe consequences. The first domino had fallen, and the entire family was now standing directly in the path of absolute financial ruin. The first domino had fallen, and the entire family was now standing directly in the path of absolute financial ruin. But the bank sending foreclosure warnings to my parents was only half of the nightmare Marcus had created for himself. Down at his rented downtown office, the facade of his tech startup was simultaneously crumbling. For months, he had been dodging his initial investors with fake spreadsheets and promises of an impending massive buyout. But those investors were not as blind or as easily manipulated as my mother. They were local businessmen who wanted to see a return on their capital. On a rainy Thursday morning, three of his primary backers showed up unannounced at his office suite. David, my private investigator, managed to obtain the security footage of the confrontation and a sworn affidavit from a receptionist who heard every word through the thin glass walls. The investors did not want another glossy presentation or a catered lunch. They demanded a complete transparent financial audit of the company by an independent third-party accounting firm. They gave Marcus exactly 10 days to open his books. If he refused, they promised to file a massive civil lawsuit for fraud and seek an emergency injunction to freeze every corporate asset he possessed. Of course, Marcus knew an audit would instantly reveal that there were no corporate assets left, there was no proprietary technology, and there was certainly no impending buyout from a Silicon Valley giant. The books would show that every dollar invested had been siphoned off to pay his personal debts and fund his lavish lifestyle. He tried his usual charm offensive, attempting to fast-talk them with buzzwords about market volatility, but they were done listening. They handed him a formal legal demand letter and walked out, leaving him completely cornered. Panic finally set in. The arrogance that usually carried Marcus through his deceptions evaporated. He rushed home early that afternoon and found Chelsea in the middle of a private yoga session in their marble kitchen. When he told her about the impending audit and the very real possibility that they were completely broke, Chelsea did not offer comfort. She did not suggest they work together to fix the mess. Instead, she threw a spectacular tantrum that shattered any remaining illusion of their happy marriage. She began screaming at him, throwing her expensive yoga blocks across the room. She hysterically declared that she would absolutely not be the laughingstock of their country club. When Marcus quietly suggested they might need to sell her newly leased luxury SUV to hire a defense attorney, Chelsea lost her mind. She shrieked that she would rather die than be seen driving a used sedan like some working-class peasant. She blamed him entirely, conveniently, ignoring the fact that she had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on vacations and designer clothes just weeks prior. She stormed out of the house, leaving him standing alone in the kitchen they could no longer afford. Desperate and running out of time, Marcus retreated to his home office and locked the door. He booted up his computer and began frantically applying for standard business loans online. He needed capital to temporarily inflate the company accounts before the auditors arrived to make it look like the business was still solvent. But reality is a cruel teacher when you have ignored it for too long. Application after application was instantly denied. His personal credit score was ruined. He had multiple defaulted credit cards, and the massive home equity loan he had manipulated our mother into taking was already flagged as delinquent. There was not a single legitimate bank, credit union, or private lender in the entire country that would lend him a single dollar. He was a walking financial liability, and the automated algorithms of the banking world rejected him with cold mechanical efficiency. He sat in the dark, staring at the glowing screen of his monitor as the rejection emails piled up in his inbox. The deadline for the audit was ticking down. The bank was threatening his parents' house. His wife was threatening to leave him if the money dried up. He had exhausted every legitimate avenue and burned every bridge. There was no one left to charm and no one left to manipulate. As desperation clouded his judgment, a dark and dangerous idea began to form in his mind. He pulled out the original property deed and the financial documents his mother had signed for the initial home equity loan. If he could not get money legally, he would simply have to take it illegally. Marcus was about to cross the hard line from being an incompetent, failed businessman directly into the realm of committing serious federal crime. The transition from an incompetent, failed businessman directly into the realm of committing serious federal crime happened late on a Friday night. Marcus sat alone in the dim light of his home office, staring at a PDF editing software he had just downloaded. He knew that institutional banks were a lost cause. His only hope now was private equity firms or venture capitalists who offered high-risk bridge loans. These firms moved fast and sometimes overlooked minor red flags if the potential return on investment was high enough. but they still required collateral and proof of revenue. Marcus had neither, so he decided to simply invent them. He started with his company financial statements. With a few clicks of his mouse, he erased the pathetic zeros in his accounts receivable column and replaced them with massive fabricated numbers. He drafted fake invoices from non-existent clients. He even went as far as forging a completely fraudulent letter of intent from a major Silicon Valley tech giant, claiming they were in the final stages of acquiring his startup for $50 million. It was a dizzying web of lies, but he knew these fake documents were not enough to secure the immediate cash injection he needed. High-tier investors always demanded hard, tangible collateral for short-term bridge loans. He opened his bottom desk drawer and pulled out the thick manila folder containing his parents' original property deed and the recent home equity loan documents. Marcus carefully scanned the official property appraisal into his computer. The colonial home in Atlanta was generously valued at $800,000. Using the editing software, Marcus meticulously deleted the 8 and typed in a 3. He then altered the comparable neighborhood sales data, transforming his parents' modest suburban house into a $3 million luxury estate on paper. He drafted a secondary deed of trust, essentially pledging the inflated equity of the home as collateral for his new loan application. He forged his mother's signature and his father's signature at the bottom of the document with practiced ease. But a loan of the magnitude he was seeking required a secondary guarantor. He needed someone with seemingly liquid assets to co-sign the agreement. He walked downstairs holding the freshly printed stack of fraudulent documents. He found Chelsea in the master bedroom, aggressively packing a designer suitcase. She was still fuming from their earlier argument and loudly threatening to move back into her mother's guest house until Marcus fixed his financial mess. Marcus quickly closed the bedroom door and spread the forged papers across the king-sized bed. He explained his highly illegal plan in explicit detail. He told her that if they could secure a $2 million bridge loan from a private equity firm, they could easily pay off the angry initial investors, hide the missing funds from the auditors, and keep her luxury SUV. He framed it not as a crime, but as a temporary necessary business maneuver. Chelsea stopped folding her expensive cashmere sweaters. She looked at the forged signatures and the fake bank balances. Any rational person would have instantly recognized the terrifying legal danger of submitting fabricated financial documents across state lines. But Chelsea was not rational. She was driven entirely by entitlement and a desperate terror of losing her elite social status. She possessed that specific brand of arrogance that convinced her rules did not apply to people who looked like her. Her greed immediately overtook whatever small shred of morality she possessed. She dropped the clothes, looked at her husband, and asked what she needed to do to make the money appear. Marcus explained that she needed to sign as the primary financial guarantor. To do that, she needed to provide proof of immense personal income. Chelsea did not hesitate for a single second. She opened her own laptop and accessed their joint tax returns from 4 years ago, which was the last time they actually had a decent combined income. With chilling efficiency, she altered the dates on the tax forms and artificially inflated her personal investment dividends by several $100,000. She printed the completely fraudulent tax returns and confidently signed her name in blue ink on the guarantor line of the loan application. She was now a willing and active co-conspirator in a massive federal fraud scheme. They spent the next 2 hours scanning the forged documents back into the computer. They packaged the highly illegal, completely fabricated financial portfolio into a sleek, professional digital presentation. Marcus compiled a list of the most aggressive top-tier venture capital and private equity firms based in New York City. He crafted a compelling email pitching his startup as the next major tech unicorn desperately needing a short-term bridge loan to finalize a massive acquisition. He attached the poisoned PDF file. Chelsea stood behind his chair, resting her manicured hands on his shoulders as he highlighted the email addresses. With a final hopeful click of the mouse, Marcus sent the fraudulent package into the digital ether, praying for a miraculous rescue from a wealthy investor. They had no idea exactly whose inbox that email was about to land in. Early the following Monday morning, the digital package arrived at the Manhattan headquarters of Apex Holdings. My firm received hundreds of investment pitches every single week. Most were poorly constructed business models from overly ambitious dreamers and were swiftly discarded by automated filtering software. However, Marcus had intentionally targeted our high-risk bridge loan division because he was asking for a massive $2 million loan. His application bypassed standard algorithms and went directly to my chief financial analyst, a brilliant man named Julian. Julian had been working with me for 3 years. He possessed an uncanny ability to spot inconsistencies in financial portfolios. He ignored flashy presentations or fabricated letters of intent. He cared about raw mathematical reality. It took him 20 minutes to realize the application from my brother was completely fraudulent. The artificially inflated revenue numbers did not align with the standard tax brackets, and the projected growth curves were mathematically impossible for a startup with zero established credit. Julian printed the entire 70-page portfolio, placed it in a red high-priority folder, and walked down the glass hallway to my private office. He knocked twice and stepped inside, placing the red folder directly on my mahogany desk. "Dr. Davenport, we have a live one," he said, sliding the documents toward me. "This is a bridge loan application from a tech startup in Atlanta. The founder is requesting $2 million and offering a piece of commercial residential real estate as collateral. But the tax returns are clearly doctored, and the property appraisal looks like it was edited using basic consumer software. It is a textbook case of wire fraud." I was about to forward this to our legal compliance team to notify the authorities, but per your standing orders, I am bringing all federal fraud attempts directly to your desk first. I thanked Julian and opened the red folder. The very first page contained the executive summary. I saw the name of the company, and my eyes instantly locked onto the name of the founder, Marcus. My heart did not skip a beat. I did not feel a sudden rush of anxiety or anger. Instead, a profound and icy sense of absolute clarity washed over me. I slowly turned the pages, examining the desperate web of lies my brother had constructed. I saw the forged invoices and the fake corporate emails. Then I reached the collateral section. Staring back at me was a digital scan of the original property deed for my parents' colonial home. I recognized every detail of that document. I knew the exact square footage of the backyard where they had hosted that pathetic barbecue instead of attending my graduation. But the numbers had been clumsily altered. Marcus had artificially inflated the value to $3 million. I flipped to the guarantor page and saw Chelsea's distinctive looping signature executed in blue ink right below a set of completely fabricated tax returns. They had actually done it. They had crossed state lines electronically to submit forged financial documents to a major New York private equity firm. They had unknowingly delivered their own execution orders directly into my hands. I carefully closed the red folder and looked up at Julian, who was waiting patiently for my instructions. Normally, we would simply reject the application and forward the evidence to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But this was not a normal situation. This was the universe delivering a perfect masterstroke of poetic justice. Julian Fye said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of emotion, "I want you to bypass the standard rejection protocol for this specific application. In fact, I want you to fast-track it through the initial approval stages." Julian blinked in surprise, clearly confused by my directive, but he knew better than to question my judgment. "Are we actually considering funding a fraudulent company?" he asked cautiously. "We are not funding anything," I replied, leaning back in my leather chair and allowing a cold, razor-sharp smile to touch my lips. "But we are going to let them believe they have won. I want you to draft a formal letter of intent on Apex Holdings letterhead. Tell the founder our executive board is incredibly impressed with his portfolio and his aggressive growth strategy. Tell him we are prepared to offer the full $2 million bridge loan. But stipulated deal of this magnitude requires a final in-person pitch. Invite him, his wife, and the primary property owners to our Manhattan office next week for a formal signing ceremony. Let them think they are about to become millionaires. Julian nodded, understanding that I was setting a massive corporate trap. I watched him leave my office and turn my chair to look at the city skyline. The bait was set. The email from Apex Holdings hit Marcus's inbox the very next morning. According to David's subsequent surveillance report, the celebration in Atlanta was nothing short of hysterical. Marcus printed the formal letter of intent and paraded it around his parents' kitchen like a winning lottery ticket. Chelsea supposedly popped a bottle of cheap champagne she had hidden in the pantry, screaming that they were finally going to be rich. They had successfully fooled a major New York private equity firm. The $2 million bridge loan was practically in their bank account. All they had to do was fly to Manhattan, shake a few hands, and sign the final paperwork. But their euphoric delusion quickly collided with their harsh financial reality. Apex Holdings expected them in New York in exactly 5 days, and they were completely broke. Chelsea immediately threw a massive fit when Marcus cautiously suggested booking economy flights and a budget hotel near the airport. She aggressively argued that top-tier investors could instantly smell desperation. If they walked into a multi-million-dollar signing ceremony looking like weary travelers who just flew coach, the deal would fall apart before it even started. She insisted they absolutely needed first-class tickets, a luxury suite at the Waldorf Astoria, and brand-new designer clothes to properly project the image of a highly successful tech founder and his wealthy elite wife. Marcus nervously agreed, but his bank accounts were heavily overdrawn, and his credit cards were completely maxed out. He could not even afford a basic bus ticket, let alone a lavish luxury trip to Manhattan. He paced the living room floor, cold panic, rising again, wondering if he should try to secure another predatory payday loan. That was the exact moment when my mother decided to take matters into her own hands. Brenda could not stand to see her golden child distressed, especially when he was supposedly on the very verge of securing his family's ultimate financial legacy. In her twisted, entitled mind, there was only one person responsible for funding this critical trip: me. I had been gone for 5 solid years, a phantom who had completely vanished from their daily lives. But Brenda possessed a terrifying, relentless determination when it came to serving Marcus. Since my old personal phone number was permanently disconnected, she spent 3 grueling days obsessively tracking my digital footprint. I had meticulously scrubbed most of my past, but she remembered the name of my doctoral advisor from university. She relentlessly called the academic department, spinning a highly dramatic, tragic web of lies about a severe family medical emergency. She harassed them until a sympathetic administrative assistant finally caved and gave her the direct corporate office number for Dr. Chloe Davenport. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when the private secure line on my mahogany desk suddenly rang. Only a select few high-level executives possessed that specific number. I pressed the speaker button and answered with my standard crisp, professional greeting. There was a brief, heavy pause on the other end, followed by a sharp, commanding intake of breath. I knew exactly who it was before she even spoke a single word. "Well, it is about time you answered," Brenda snapped loudly. Her voice dripped with the exact same condescending authority she had always used to completely dismiss me. She offered absolutely no apology for missing my graduation 5 years ago. She did not ask how I was doing, if I was healthy, or where I had been living. She simply picked up her verbal whip and expected me to instantly obey. "Listen carefully to me, Chloe," she continued rapidly, not allowing me a single second to speak. "Your brother is on the verge of closing a massive multi-million-dollar deal with a major investment firm in New York. He is finally making our family name mean something important. But his funds are temporarily tied up in escrow, and he desperately needs to fly up there with Chelsea to finalize the legal paperwork. We expect you to wire exactly $50,000 to his joint account by tomorrow morning to properly cover his travel and upscale accommodations." Consider it overdue repayment for everything we generously provided for you growing up. If you refuse to financially support your own blood family right now, do not ever bother trying to come back to our home. I sat perfectly still, listening to the sheer staggering audacity echoing through the high-definition speakerphone. She was aggressively demanding $50,000 to proudly fund the very trip that would lead her precious son directly into a federal prison cell. I slowly reached out and pressed the discreet red button on my phone console, activating the legally compliant recording system I used for all corporate negotiations. "Mom," I said, my voice completely devoid of the cowering fear she fully expected to hear. "I am absolutely not going to wire you $50,000. Brenda gasped, her anger immediately flaring. "You ungrateful little brat," she hissed. "You are trying to sabotage him because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of Marcus. He is going to be a millionaire, and you will be nothing." I let her rage burn itself out against the absolute silence of my office. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, I leaned closer to the microphone. "I am not trying to sabotage him," I replied smoothly, a cold smile forming on my face. "I think this trip is exactly what he needs. In fact, I am sure Marcus will get exactly what he deserves in New York." I pressed the button and disconnected the call. When the line went dead in Atlanta, my mother must have been absolutely livid. According to the comprehensive report I later received from David, they did not let my refusal stop them. Driven by a toxic mixture of desperation and immense arrogance, Marcus and Chelsea scrambled to find the money for their luxury trip. Since their credit was entirely destroyed and traditional banks had locked them out, they turned to the absolute bottom of the financial barrel. They took out multiple predatory payday loans with staggering triple-digit interest rates. Marcus even managed to secure a shady title loan on his father's 10-year-old sedan. They leveraged the very last scraps of their existence to scrape together $30,000. It was a spectacular display of financial suicide, all to afford first-class tickets and a 2-night stay at a 5-star hotel in Manhattan. By the time they arrived at the towering glass and steel skyscraper that housed Apex Holdings on Tuesday morning, they were practically vibrating with nervous energy. They walked through the massive revolving doors of the lobby, looking exactly like people who were trying much too hard to appear wealthy. Marcus wore a poorly tailored suit that he likely bought off the rack the day before. Chelsea was draped in flashy designer logos from head to toe, desperately clutching a knockoff handbag. My parents trailed slightly behind them, looking overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the Manhattan financial district. Brenda, however, kept her chin held high, clinging to the delusion that she was the esteemed matriarch of a tech billionaire. They approached the sleek marble front desk, ready to conquer the corporate world. Behind the desk stood Renee, my vice president of operations. Renee was a brilliant, striking black woman with 2 master degrees and a razor-sharp mind. She had stepped in to handle the front desk reception for this specific meeting strictly at my request. I wanted my family to be greeted by the very demographic they so casually looked down upon. I wanted to see exactly how they would behave when they thought they were dealing with someone beneath them. Chelsea marched right up to the marble counter and loudly cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, snapping her manicured fingers in a blatantly disrespectful manner. "We are here for a very important executive signing ceremony. Tell whoever is in charge that Marcus and Chelsea have arrived. And please have someone fetch us some sparkling water immediately. My husband is extremely parched from our first-class flight. We do not have time to stand around waiting in a lobby." Renee did not even blink. She maintained a perfectly neutral professional expression. She looked at Chelsea and then at Marcus, absorbing their completely transparent facade. "Welcome to Apex Holdings," she said, her voice smooth and impeccably polite. "I have your party listed right here on the executive schedule. If you will please provide your identification, I can issue your temporary security badges and escort you up to the proper floor for your meeting." Chelsea rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh. "Are you deaf or just slow?" she muttered, loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. We do not need security badges. We are practically partners with the CEO. Just buzz us up or get someone who actually understands how this building works. You clearly do not comprehend the magnitude of the deal we are signing today. Go find a manager to help us right now. My mother immediately stepped forward, placing a hand on Chelsea's arm, but not to correct her terrible behavior. Chelsea. Dear, let the girl do her job, Brenda said, offering Renee a deeply condescending smile. She probably does not see people like us very often. Just hand her your identification so we can go upstairs and collect our money. We can speak to her supervisor later if she continues to be unhelpful. There is no need to cause a scene. Renee smiled back, a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. She expertly processed their driver licenses and handed them 4 temporary visitor badges. She did not bother to correct Chelsea's ignorant assumption about her true job title. There was absolutely no need to waste breath on arrogant people who were currently walking straight toward a financial guillotine. Renee stepped out from behind the marble desk, smoothing her tailored designer skirt. If you will follow me, I will personally escort you up, she said gracefully, gesturing toward the private elevators. The high-speed elevator shot up to the top floor of the skyscraper. When the doors opened, Renee led them down a wide hallway to the primary boardroom. It was a massive corner space encased entirely in floor-to-ceiling glass. Please wait. Inside, she instructed, gesturing toward the massive room. Renee closed the heavy oak doors firmly behind them, leaving the 4 of them alone in the absolute pinnacle of corporate power. The boardroom was intentionally designed to intimidate and overwhelm anyone who stepped inside. The entire far wall was made of sheer glass, offering a dizzying, unobstructed view of the Manhattan skyline. A custom-built 20-foot mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by plush imported leather chairs. Everything from the thick woven carpet to the sleek, hidden technology screamed institutional wealth. It was a room where fortunes were made and destroyed with a single stroke of a pen. Marcus immediately walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, pressing his hands against the glass and looking down at the city streets far below. He let out a loud, arrogant laugh. "Look at this, Chelsea," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "This is where we belong. I told you my vision was going to pay off. After today, we are never flying commercial again. I am going to ask for an immediate advance on the $2 million, so we can go shopping on Fifth Avenue before our flight back to Atlanta. I want a new watch to celebrate." Chelsea did not even bother to look out the window. She was already busy pulling out her phone and snapping selfies at the head of the polished mahogany table, making sure the Apex Holdings logo, etched into the glass wall behind her, was perfectly visible in the frame. "Make sure you get them to validate our hotel parking," she muttered while checking her angles on the screen. "And you really need to mention that receptionist to whoever is running this meeting. It is completely unacceptable for a company of this caliber to hire such rude, unpolished staff. She did not even offer to take my coat. When we close this deal, I want her fired. She needs to learn her place and realize who she is dealing with." Brenda walked around the room, running her hands over the expensive leather chairs with a look of absolute reverence. She beamed at Marcus, her eyes shining with maternal pride. "I always knew you were destined for greatness, Marcus," she cooed loudly. "From the time you were a little boy, I knew you were going to be a millionaire. You have the vision and the drive that this family needed. You are building a true family legacy. Just think about how foolish your sister must feel right now, living her sad little life wherever she ended up. She refused to help fund your dream because she is selfish. She could have been part of this if she had just learned to support you and respect her family. Now she gets absolutely nothing, and we are going to have everything. Derek." My father simply took a seat near the back of the room. He looked deeply uncomfortable in his cheap suit, glancing nervously at the expensive artwork on the walls. He remained entirely silent as his wife praised the son who had just secretly forged his signature on a fraudulent federal document. Derek had spent his entire life being a complicit enabler, refusing to ever challenge Brenda or discipline Marcus. Even now, standing in the middle of a massive financial lie, he chose the path of least resistance. He did not care about the ethics of the situation, as long as he did not have to argue with my mother. "Just stick to the script, son," he finally mumbled, staring down at his hands. "Let us just sign the paperwork, get the money, and go home before anyone asks too many questions." Marcus nodded eagerly, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket. He began pacing the length of the long room, rapidly rehearsing his pitch one last time. He mumbled the fake revenue numbers and the fabricated user acquisition metrics, trying to make the lies sound as natural as possible. He practiced his confident billionaire smile in the reflection of the glass wall, adjusting his tie. "Remember Chelsea," he instructed, pointing a finger at his wife. "If they ask about the collateral, just smile and let me handle the talking. The house appraisal is solid. The tax returns are solid. We just need to project total confidence. These New York finance guys are like sharks. If they smell fear, they will lower the valuation. We have to walk in here acting like we do not even need their money." They were completely intoxicated by their own delusions. They stood in the very heart of my empire, congratulating themselves on a victory they had not yet won. They honestly believed their poorly executed forgery had outsmarted a multi-million-dollar private equity firm. They thought they were the predators who had successfully hunted their prey. They had absolutely no idea they were just chum swimming blindly into a steel cage. They were so busy counting money that did not exist, they failed to notice the subtle click of the recording devices activating in the ceiling corners. The digital clock on the sleek wall monitor clicked perfectly to 10:00 in the morning, marking the exact beginning of their total destruction. The heavy oak doors at the end of the boardroom suddenly unlatched with a loud mechanical click. The heavy hinges swung open. The CEO entered the room. I stepped through the heavy oak doors and let them swing shut behind me with a solid, reassuring thud. The room instantly fell so quiet, you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents. I paused for a fraction of a second, at the threshold, allowing them to take in my appearance. I was not wearing the cheap department store clothes they remembered from 5 years ago. I was wearing a $5,000 tailored charcoal suit, pristine white silk blouse, and black stilettos that clicked sharply against the hardwood floor as I moved forward. My hair was impeccably styled, and my posture was entirely unyielding. I looked exactly like what I was, which was a highly successful corporate apex predator. For a long suspended moment, nobody moved. They stood frozen in various states of absolute shock. Marcus actually dropped the crumpled piece of paper he had been rehearsing from. It fluttered silently to the floor, landing near his cheap leather shoes. Chelsea simply stared at me with her mouth slightly open, her phone still clutched in her hand, halfway through taking another selfie. My father, Derek, slowly lowered himself back into his chair, as if his legs had suddenly lost the ability to support his weight. They had built up this massive fantasy of a wealthy white male billionaire walking through those doors to hand them a giant check. The sheer cognitive dissonance of seeing the sister they had discarded standing before them, dripping in wealth and corporate authority, completely short-circuited their brains. Of course, it was my mother who broke the silence. Brenda could never tolerate being out of control of a situation, and she certainly could never tolerate me looking superior to her precious golden child. Her initial shock rapidly morphed into deep, aggressive annoyance. She stepped away from the leather chair she had been admiring and marched toward me, her face flushed red with indignation. "Chloe, what on earth are you doing here?" Brenda demanded, her voice sharp and echoing loudly across the long boardroom. "How did you even know we were in New York today? Did you seriously track us down just to ruin your brother's big moment?" I did not answer her immediately. I simply continued walking until I reached the massive mahogany table. I trailed my fingertips lightly along the polished edge, projecting an aura of absolute calm that clearly infuriated her even more. "I asked you a question," Brenda snapped, closing the distance between us. "This is a highly secure private equity firm. You cannot just wander into an executive boardroom while we are waiting for a multi-million-dollar signing ceremony. Are you working here now? Is that it? Are you playing secretary for the executives? Well, you need to leave immediately. Marcus is about to pitch his business to the chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, and you are going to embarrass us. Go find whoever is actually in charge and tell them we are ready. Marcus finally found his voice stepping up right beside our mother. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to reclaim the arrogant swagger he had been practicing just minutes earlier. Yeah, Chloe. You need to get out of here right now, he said, pointing a shaking finger toward the oak doors. I am not letting your petty jealousy sabotage the biggest financial deal of my life. Go fetch the boss before I report you to Human Resources and have you fired for interrupting a private client meeting. Chelsea scoffed loudly from the window, crossing her arms over her chest. Honestly, this is just pathetic, she sneered. You actually stalked us all the way to Manhattan. Marcus, tell her to go get our sparkling water and then leave. We do not have time for her little family drama. I looked at the four of them standing there, completely trapped in their own spectacular ignorance. They were so deeply committed to their narrative of my inferiority that they could not process the obvious reality staring them right in the face. I walked past my mother, ignoring her outstretched hand. I moved directly to the head of the massive mahogany table. This was the seat of power, the single chair reserved exclusively for the person who controlled the entire room. I slowly pulled the heavy leather chair out and sat down. I rested my forearms on the polished wood and clasped my hands together. I looked directly into my brother's panicked eyes, and then shifted my gaze to my mother, whose face was slowly draining of color as the horrifying truth finally began to dawn on her. I am not playing secretary, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register that commanded absolute attention. I am the boss. I own Apex Holdings, and as of this morning, I own your debt. Marcus let out a sudden sharp bark of laughter. It was a weak, nervous sound that bounced awkwardly off the glass walls. He ran a hand through his hair and took a step toward the mahogany table, forcing a wide, unnatural smile onto his face. Wow, little sister, he chuckled, shaking his head, as if we were simply sharing an inside joke. You really pulled one over on us. I have to admit, I am incredibly impressed. Well, this actually makes things so much easier. Since we are family, we can just skip all the tedious corporate formalities and get straight to the funding transfer. You know how solid my business model is. We can keep all the profits right here in the family. Sit down, Marcus, I commanded. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer absolute authority in my tone made him freeze instantly. I am not your little sister today, and this is not a family reunion. This is a formal financial review of the bridge loan application you submitted to my firm. I picked up a sleek silver remote from the center of the table and pressed a single button. The massive glass wall behind me instantly shifted from transparent to a dark, opaque black. A high-definition laser projector hummed to life overhead, casting the exact 70-page digital portfolio Marcus had submitted directly onto the massive screen. The fabricated numbers loomed over them in glowing white text. Let us deconstruct this highly imaginative fairy tale you sent to my chief analyst, I said, resting my elbows on the table. You are asking Apex Holdings for a $2 million cash injection based on a projected quarterly revenue of $400,000. However, a basic forensic sweep of your corporate routing numbers reveals that your actual gross revenue for the past 5 years has been exactly $0. You do not have a single paying client. You do not even employ a single software engineer. You are running a glorified shell company that exists solely to funnel seed money from gullible local investors into your personal checking accounts. Marcus swallowed hard, his artificial smile completely vanishing. He looked frantically at the screen and then back at me. Chloe, you do not understand, he stammered, his voice pitching up in panic. The market shifted. We had unexpected developmental delays, but we are in late-stage talks with a massive Silicon Valley buyer. I even included their signed letter of intent in the packet. I just need a short bridge loan to cover operating costs. I clicked the remote again. The screen shifted, displaying the supposedly confidential letter of intent he had forged. I reached into a leather folder on my desk and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the polished wood. "You mean this letter?" I asked, my voice dripping with pure corporate disdain. "I personally called the chief executive officer of that tech giant yesterday morning. We serve on the same private equity advisory board. He has never heard of you. He has never heard of your startup. Furthermore, the corporate letterhead you used was officially phased out of their company 3 years ago. A first-year university finance intern would have flagged this pathetic document in exactly 3 minutes. You failed to match the font kerning, and you forged the signature of an executive who retired last spring." The boardroom was dead silent. My mother was gripping the back of a leather chair, her knuckles turning stark white. Derek was staring at his shoes, looking physically ill. Marcus stood completely exposed, stripped of his arrogance and his golden child armor. He had nowhere to hide. I laid out every single one of his financial failures with brutal surgical precision. I detailed how he had burned through his initial investor capital, how he had defaulted on multiple high-interest loans, and how his company was nothing more than a spectacular monument to his own staggering incompetence. "You walked into one of the most ruthless venture capital firms in Manhattan, thinking you could secure $2 million with a fake document," I said, shaking my head. "You are not a tech visionary, Marcus. You are a very stupid fraud." Chelsea suddenly slammed her hands down on the mahogany table, her face twisted in a mask of righteous indignation. She could not handle watching her husband be systematically dismantled. "You cannot speak to him like that," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the room. She immediately defaulted to playing the victim, a role she had perfected. "You have no idea how hard we have been struggling. We are victims of a terrible economy. We came here seeking help in good faith, and you are just bullying us because you have always been a bitter, jealous person. You should be using your wealth to uplift your brother, not tear him down." I slowly turned my cold gaze away from Marcus and fixed it entirely on Chelsea. I picked up the silver remote and clicked the button one more time. "Let us talk about your deep financial struggles, Chelsea," I said softly, as the massive screen behind me shifted to display her heavily redacted credit card statements and private banking records. "Let us talk about exactly how much it costs to be a victim." The massive screen illuminated the dark boardroom with a blinding display of Chelsea's recent financial transactions. I highlighted charges from luxury resorts and expensive cars she leased, tens of thousands of dollars spent on pure vanity, while her husband's business actively bled out. I looked at Chelsea, who was stammering and trying to cover her face. "You are not a victim, Chelsea," I stated firmly. "You are an active participant in your own financial ruin. You gladly spent money that did not exist, and now you want someone else to foot the bill." My mother could no longer contain her fury. Brenda slammed her hands down on the polished mahogany table and leaned forward, her eyes burning with rage. "Stop it right now, Chloe," she screamed, her voice cracking under the immense strain. "You are completely out of line. You have absolutely no right to sit there and bully your brother and his wife. They came to you for legitimate business help, and you are using your position to publicly humiliate them. You are a spiteful, vindictive child, and I am deeply ashamed to call you my daughter. We are leaving now. Marcus, gather your things. We do not need her dirty money. We will find a real investor who values family." Brenda turned to grab her purse fully, expecting Marcus and Derek to blindly follow her out the door, just as they had always done. But nobody moved. Marcus was still staring blankly at the screen, completely paralyzed by the exposure of his lies. Derek remained glued to his leather chair, his head hanging low in absolute defeat. "You are not going anywhere, Mom," I said, my voice remaining perfectly level. "And you are certainly not going to find another investor, because there is one final piece of business we need to address before you leave my building." I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a thick red file folder. I tossed it casually across the long mahogany table. It slid smoothly across the polished wood and came to a stop directly in front of my father, Derek slowly lifted his head and stared at the red folder, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. "Open it, Dad," I commanded. With trembling hands, Derek flipped open the heavy red cover. Inside was a massive stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. He read the top page, and all the remaining color instantly drained from his weathered face. He let out a soft, choked gasp and slumped back into his chair, clutching his chest. "What is it, Derek?" my mother demanded, snatching the documents out of his hands. She scanned the first few lines, and her mouth fell open in total shock. "That is the original deed to your 4-bedroom colonial home in Atlanta," I explained calmly, folding my hands together on the table, along with the complete documentation of the massive $400,000 home equity loan you so generously took out to fund your golden child's fantasy. As you are well aware, you have not made a single payment on that loan in over 4 months. The bank officially declared the loan in default and placed the property into pre-foreclosure status last week. Brenda looked up at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying realization. "But how did you get this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I bought it," I replied smoothly. When a bank is holding toxic debt on a defaulted property, they often sell that debt to private equity firms for pennies on the dollar to quickly clear their books. My analysts flagged the property address during a routine acquisition sweep. Apex Holdings purchased your defaulted mortgage from the bank 3 days ago. I am now the sole legal owner of your debt. The sheer gravity of the situation finally crashed down upon them, crushing their arrogance into dust. They had walked into my boardroom thinking they were going to secure millions of dollars. Instead, they discovered they no longer even owned the roof over their heads. My mother began to hyperventilate, clutching the thick stack of legal papers against her chest. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. "You cannot do this, Chloe," she pleaded, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. "That is our home. That is where you grew up. You cannot just take it away from us." I stood up from my chair and looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. I felt absolutely nothing for her. "You chose his barbecue over my graduation," I said, my voice cold and unyielding. "Now you can host your next barbecue in the street because I am foreclosing on your house." The heavy silence that followed my declaration felt thick enough to suffocate them. My mother simply stared at the red folder, her mouth opening and closing silently, as her mind completely failed to process the magnitude of their ruin. She had always believed she was untouchable simply because she was the loudest and most demanding person in any room. But raw financial power does not care about her demands. It only cares about leverage, and I held every single ounce of it. Chelsea was completely frozen in her chair, her designer handbag slipping from her fingers and hitting the floor with a dull thud. Her entire carefully constructed world of luxury leased cars and country club lunches had just violently imploded. For the first time in my entire life, my father finally found the courage to speak up. Derek leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the polished mahogany table. He looked up at me with eyes full of desperate, pleading tears pooling in the corners. "Chloe, please," he begged, his voice trembling with genuine terror. "You cannot do this to us. We are your family. We gave you a home. We fed you and clothed you. You cannot just throw your own flesh and blood out onto the street. You have to show us some mercy. We made mistakes, but we are still your family." I looked at the man who had passively watched me suffer for decades. I felt no pity. "Derek," I said, keeping my voice absolutely flat and void of any emotion, "you do not get to use the word family to manipulate me. You forfeited that right a long time ago. A real father protects his children. You never protected me. You protected your own peace and quiet. You allowed a deeply toxic woman to systematically emotionally abuse me because it was easier than standing up to her." Derek flinched as if I had struck him, but I refused to stop. I laid out his exact failures. I reminded him of the time Marcus stole my college savings to buy a sports car, and Derek simply told me to be the bigger person. I reminded him of the countless family dinners where Brenda humiliated me, and he just stared down at his plate completely silent. I reminded him of my high school graduation when he let them leave early because Marcus was bored. You stood by and watched them slowly try to destroy my spirit, I continued. You enabled her cruelty and you funded his theft. You co-signed that massive fraudulent loan because you were too weak to say no to your wife. You are not a victim of circumstance, Derek. You are the architect of your own destruction. Your silence was a choice, and this foreclosure is simply the consequence of that choice. My words hit him like physical blows. He dropped his face into his hands and began to sob openly, his shoulders shaking under his cheap suit. Brenda tried to comfort him, but she was too paralyzed by the shock of losing her house. The reality of their total ruin had finally settled over them like a heavy, suffocating blanket. They had absolutely nothing left. Their golden child had bankrupted them, and the scapegoat they discarded was the one holding the axe. But Marcus was never one to accept defeat gracefully. His entire identity was built on a massive, fragile ego, and that ego had just been completely shattered in front of his wife and parents. He could not handle the humiliation of being exposed as a fraud and a failure. The panic in his eyes suddenly ignited into blind, desperate rage. He could not accept that I had outsmarted him at every single turn. He slammed both fists down onto the table with a loud crack that made Chelsea jump. He pushed his chair back violently, sending it crashing into the glass wall behind him. His face twisted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. He was no longer trying to play the charming tech visionary. He was a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just snapped completely shut. "You arrogant little witch!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You set us up! You lured us up here just to humiliate us and steal our house. You think you are so smart with your fancy suits and your corporate titles, but you are nothing. I am not going to let you get away with this. I will drag you through the mud. I will hire the best lawyers in New York. I will personally sue you and your entire company for predatory lending and extortion. I will take everything you have." He lunged forward across the mahogany table, his hands reaching aggressively toward me. I did not flinch or move a single muscle as my brother threw his weight across the massive mahogany table. His face was twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, and his hands grasped blindly at the empty air just inches from my tailored silk blouse. He wanted to physically intimidate me just like he had always done when we were children. But we were no longer in our parents' kitchen. We were in my domain. Before he could reach any further, Renee stepped out from the shadows near the door. I had intentionally positioned her there for this exact reason. She moved with lightning speed and absolute precision. She placed a firm, heavy hand on his shoulder and shoved him forcefully back down into his leather chair. "Sit down, and do not move a single muscle," Renee commanded, her voice ringing with icy, undeniable authority. Marcus slumped backward into the seat, his chest heaving as he continued to glare at me with wild, desperate eyes. "You are going to sue me, Marcus?" I asked, tilting my head slightly and offering him a look of profound, absolute pity. "You want to hire the best corporate lawyers in New York City to sue my private equity firm for predatory lending. That is a truly fascinating legal strategy. Let us take a moment to examine exactly how that hypothetical lawsuit would actually play out in a federal court of law. You just boldly claimed that I lured you up here to extort you. But Apex Holdings did not seek you out. We did not send you a marketing brochure or invite you to apply for funding. You explicitly and deliberately targeted us. You willingly compiled a 70-page digital portfolio containing completely fabricated corporate revenue streams and fake user acquisition metrics. You artificially altered a legal property appraisal to inflate the value of a house that was already in active pre-foreclosure. And you submitted joint tax returns that were entirely forged from top to bottom. I reached out and firmly pressed a small silver button on the sleek communication console built into my desk. A subtle green light illuminated, indicating the external security protocols were now officially activated. You did not just tell a few minor lies on a piece of paper to look impressive, Marcus. I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the executive boardroom. You attached those forged financial documents to an electronic communication, and you actively transmitted them across state lines from Georgia to New York. You did this in a deliberate, calculated attempt to illegally secure $2 million from a registered financial institution. Do you have any idea what that actually means in the real world? Under United States federal law, that specific action is strictly defined as wire fraud and bank fraud. It is not a simple civil dispute over a misunderstood contract. It is a highly serious federal felony offense. The room grew so incredibly quiet that I could hear the erratic, ragged breathing of my father sitting at the end of the table. The color had instantly drained from Chelsea's face as the terrifying legal reality of my words finally began to penetrate her thick wall of entitlement. She looked down at her shaking hands, her designer ring suddenly looking very heavy and cheap. "And let us certainly not forget our generous secondary guarantor," I said, shifting my cold gaze directly to my sister-in-law. "Chelsea, you knowingly signed your name to a fraudulent legal document. You willfully submitted doctored personal tax records to artificially inflate your combined liquid assets. That makes you an active and willing co-conspirator in a massive interstate scheme to defraud a private equity firm. The mandatory federal penalty for wire fraud carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary for each individual count." My mother let out a loud, piercing gasp, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table, as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from underneath her. She looked back and forth between Marcus and me, her eyes wide with mounting horror. "You cannot do this, Chloe!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly against the glass walls. "We are your family! You would not actually send your own flesh and blood brother and his wife to a federal prison. You are just trying to scare us. Tell me you are just trying to scare us." I looked at the woman who had demanded $50,000 from me just days ago, and I smiled a cold, empty smile. "I do not have a brother," I replied softly, leaning back in my chair. "Apex Holdings operates under a very strict corporate compliance protocol regarding attempted financial crimes. When we detect fraud of this massive magnitude, we do not simply reject the loan application and send you home. We are legally obligated to immediately notify the proper authorities and turn over all recorded evidence." The heavy oak boardroom doors suddenly clicked unlatched. Two federal agents stepped into the room. The agents walked past Renee with heavy, determined footsteps. They wore sharp, dark suits with golden shields clipped to their belts. The taller agent looked directly at my brother, asking him to confirm his identity. Marcus was completely speechless. He just stared at the badges with his mouth open. The agent did not wait for a verbal response. He pulled out a thick document. He announced in a loud, clear voice that he was executing a federal arrest warrant for Marcus and Chelsea on multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. Total chaos erupted inside the executive boardroom. My mother let out a loud scream, trying to throw herself between the agents and her golden child. Renee firmly guided my hysterical mother back into her seat, warning her that interfering was a criminal offense. Derek simply buried his face in his hands, weeping loudly. Marcus raised his hands in a weak, defensive gesture, babbling incoherently about a simple misunderstanding and begging for a chance to call his lawyer. But the most spectacular reaction came from Chelsea. The moment the federal agent read her name from the arrest warrant, her entire demeanor shifted with terrifying speed. The arrogant, entitled woman who had just demanded sparkling water and insulted my staff completely vanished. In her place appeared a desperately weeping, fragile victim. She took 3 large steps backward, physically distancing herself from her husband as if he were suddenly infected with a deadly disease. She covered her face with her hands and forced loud, dramatic sobs to echo through the room. "Please, you have to listen to me," Chelsea cried out, dropping to her knees and looking up at the federal agents with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I did not do anything wrong. I am just a victim in all of this. He made me do it." She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Marcus, who looked back at her in absolute stunned disbelief. He is a very aggressive man and he has a terrible temper. He locked me in our bedroom and forced me to sign those papers. I was terrified for my life. You know how big and threatening he can be. I had absolutely no idea what those documents even were. I am just a frightened wife who was trying to survive a highly abusive situation. Please do not arrest me. I want to go home to my mother. It was a sickening display of weaponized white tears. She was deliberately leaning into deeply ingrained racial stereotypes, painting my brother as an aggressive, threatening black man, while casting herself as the innocent, helpless white woman. She was perfectly willing to throw her husband completely under the bus and ensure he received a maximum prison sentence if it meant saving her own skin. She sobbed louder, clutching the edge of the mahogany table and begging the agents to protect her from him. Marcus finally snapped out of his shock and turned on her with explosive fury. "You lying snake!" he screamed, his voice cracking with panic and rage. "You knew exactly what we were doing. You were the one who altered your own tax returns. You were the one who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on designer clothes and luxury vacations. You begged me to find the money to keep your expensive leased car. Do not stand there and act like you were forced into anything. You were completely in on the plan from the very beginning." They stood there screaming at each other, hurling vicious insults and exposing every dark, selfish secret of their toxic marriage. The pristine executive boardroom devolved into a pathetic arena where two greedy criminals fought like cornered rats. My parents watched in absolute horror as the perfect relationship they had constantly praised and idolized was violently torn to shreds in front of them. I remained seated silently, observing the absolute destruction of their entire world. Chelsea scrambled to her feet and reached out to grab the sleeve of the taller federal agent. She turned on her most pathetic, pleading voice, promising to cooperate fully and testify against Marcus if they would just let her walk out the door. She truly believed her tears and her performance would magically shield her from the consequences of her own actions. She thought the system would naturally protect her just as it always had before. The federal agent simply looked down at her hand on his sleeve and calmly instructed her to just step back. He did not look very sympathetic. He looked incredibly annoyed by her display. He ignored her dramatic fake tears completely, noting that they already legally possessed her digital signature logs and a massive trail of emails she had personally sent, coordinating the entire massive fraud. The taller federal agent gestured to his partner, who stepped forward and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The sound of the metal ratchets clicking open echoed sharply in the quiet boardroom, slicing through Chelsea's continued pathetic sobbing. The agent grabbed Marcus by the arm, turning him around and forcefully pulling his hands behind his back. Marcus did not even try to fight back. All the fake billionaire swagger had completely drained from his body, leaving him as nothing more than a hollow, terrified shell. He just stared blankly at the glass wall, watching his own reflection, as the cold steel clamped tightly around his wrists with a loud, unforgiving click. He began muttering incoherently under his breath, repeating over and over that his business was real and that the investors just needed more time. He was completely disconnected from reality, still desperately clinging to the delusion that he was a misunderstood genius rather than a common federal criminal. Chelsea, however, did not go quietly. When the second agent reached for her arms, she completely lost whatever small shred of dignity she had left. She thrashed backward, knocking over one of the expensive leather chairs and shrieking at the top of her lungs. She screamed that they were making a massive mistake. She demanded to speak to the manager of the FBI. She cried that the metal cuffs were going to deeply bruise her wrists and ruin her designer silk blouse. The agent remained completely unfazed by her upper-class temper tantrum. He expertly caught her flailing arm, twisted it firmly behind her back, and locked the handcuffs into place. She let out a loud, dramatic wail, letting her knees buckle, so the agent was forced to physically hold her up by her arms. As he secured her, the taller agent began reading them, their Miranda rights, his deep voice speaking the familiar legal warnings that cemented the absolute finality of their situation. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Watching her golden child get read his rights by federal law enforcement finally shattered the last remaining fragments of my mother's deeply fabricated reality. Brenda realized that her screaming and demanding held absolutely no power here. The authorities did not care about her maternal authority. The only person in the entire skyscraper who possessed the power to potentially stop this nightmare was the daughter she had spent 30 years actively destroying. Brenda slowly turned away from Marcus and looked at me. Her face was a horrific mask of smeared makeup and pure, unrestrained terror. Her legs gave out completely. She dropped hard onto the expensive woven carpet right beside my designer stilettos. She fell to her knees, crawling slightly forward until she was looking up at me from the floor. "Chloe, please," she begged, her voice a desperate, ragged whisper. "Please tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. Tell them we had a verbal agreement. Tell them you gave him permission to use the house. You own this entire company, Chloe. You can make this go away with one single word. He is your brother. He is my baby. You cannot let them take my baby away to a prison cell. He will not survive in there. I will do anything you want. I will apologize for the graduation. I will apologize for the necklace. Just tell these men that this is a private family matter and tell them to let him go." I looked down at the woman kneeling at my feet. For my entire childhood, I had desperately craved her approval. I had twisted myself into knots trying to be perfect, hoping that one day she would look at me with pride instead of constant irritation. But looking at her now begging on the floor for the son who had actively ruined their lives, I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional well had completely dried up. I did not feel a sudden surge of triumphant joy, and I did not feel any lingering sorrow. I just felt an icy, absolute calm. I slowly stood up from my leather chair, smoothing out the front of my tailored suit. I looked down into my mother's terrified, weeping eyes, and my expression remained completely unreadable. "When I called you from my empty graduation auditorium 5 years ago, you told me to stop ruining the mood." I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any warmth. "You told me to stop being dramatic because Marcus was handling important business, so I took your advice. I stopped begging for a seat at your table. I built my own table. I built this entire skyscraper. I am not being dramatic, Mom. I am just doing business." I gave a brief nod to the federal agents. They tightened their grip on their prisoners and began marching them toward the heavy oak doors. Chelsea wailed loudly, her voice echoing tragically as she was dragged across the room. Marcus kept his head hung low in absolute shame, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The doors swung open and the agents escorted them out into the hallway. I watched them disappear into the secure elevator, knowing with absolute certainty that their fraudulent empire was permanently destroyed, and their lives as they knew them were effectively over. The heavy oak doors swung shut with a soft mechanical click, sealing the three of us inside the executive boardroom. The absolute silence that descended upon the room was deafening. It was a thick, heavy quiet that pressed against the eardrums, a stark contrast to the hysterical screaming and crying that had filled the space just moments prior. The only sound was the erratic, shallow breathing of my mother, who was still slumped on the expensive woven carpet. My father remained completely paralyzed in his leather chair, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table as if he had suffered a massive stroke. The golden child was gone. The illusion of their superiority was completely shattered. They were finally alone with the scapegoat they had created. I slowly walked back to my seat at the head of the table. I did not offer my mother a hand to help her up from the floor. I did not ask my father if he needed a glass of water. The time for familial compassion had expired exactly 5 years ago in an empty graduation auditorium. I reached into the deep drawer of my desk and pulled out a single crisp manila envelope. I placed it on the table and slid it carefully toward my father. It glided across the smooth wood and stopped right next to the red foreclosure folder. Derek slowly blinked his eyes, struggling to pull himself out of his catatonic state. He looked down at the envelope, but made absolutely no move to touch it. Brenda finally dragged herself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the back of her chair. Her designer makeup was completely ruined, running down her cheeks in dark, muddy streaks. She looked exhausted, broken, and suddenly very old. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice completely hoarse from screaming. "That is a formal, legally binding 30-day notice to vacate the premises," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even and professional. "As the new legal owner of the property, I am exercising my right to take full possession. You have exactly 30 calendar days from this exact moment to pack your belongings and vacate the house in Atlanta. If you are not completely moved out by midnight on the 30th day, I will have local law enforcement physically remove you from the property and your remaining possessions will be seized and discarded." Derek finally looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen. "Chloe, where are we supposed to go?" he asked, his voice trembling with pathetic weakness. "We do not have any savings left. Marcus took everything. We cannot afford to rent a new place on such short notice. We will be completely homeless." I looked at my father and felt absolutely zero guilt. "That is a logistical problem for you and your wife to figure out, Derek," I replied coldly. "You should have considered your retirement housing options before you secretly signed away your only financial safety net to fund a fake tech startup. You gambled your entire life on Marcus. You bet on the wrong child. I am not a charity, and I am certainly not your safety net. You allowed my mother to treat me like a burden my entire life. Now you are learning what a real burden feels like." Brenda let out a bitter, sobbing laugh, gripping the edge of the table. "You are a monster," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom despite her defeated posture. She still refused to take any accountability. "You planned this. You waited 5 years just to destroy us. You are enjoying seeing your own parents suffer. No normal person would do this to the people who gave them life." I refused to engage in her emotional manipulation. I did not raise my voice or take the bait. I simply looked at her with the cold, calculating eyes of a corporate executive. "I did not plan for Marcus to commit federal wire fraud," I stated calmly. "I did not plan for you to leverage your house for a lie. You destroyed yourselves by being greedy and arrogant. I simply bought the debt you willingly created." I stepped back from the table and picked up my silver remote, clicking a button to turn off the overhead projector. The massive screen went dark, casting the room back into natural sunlight. The bright Manhattan skyline gleamed through the glass walls, a sharp contrast to the dark, miserable reality my parents were now trapped inside. I smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored suit jacket and picked up my leather portfolio. "There is nothing left to discuss here," I said, preparing to leave. "The legal paperwork is in front of you. My security team will escort you out of the building. Do not attempt to contact my office again. Do not attempt to call me. If you refuse to leave the property in 30 days, my lawyers will handle the eviction through the courts." I turned my back on them and began walking toward the heavy oak doors. I did not look over my shoulder. I did not wait for another tearful apology or angry outburst. They were no longer my parents. They were simply defaulted tenants occupying an asset in my corporate portfolio. The transaction was complete and I was walking away to initiate the final definitive severing of the bloodline. I had just turned my back and taken 3 steps toward the heavy oak doors when I heard the sudden frantic scraping of a leather chair against the floorboards. My mother was not going to let me walk away. For 33 years, she had dictated the terms of every single interaction we ever had. She had always commanded the room, demanding absolute submission from me. The realization that she had completely lost control of the narrative and lost her house finally pushed her over the edge of reason. She let out a guttural, desperate shriek and lunged across the boardroom. "Chloe, you wait right there!" Brenda screamed, her footsteps thudding heavily against the woven carpet. "You do not get to walk away from me. I am your mother, and I demand that you fix this right now." She reached out wildly, her hands hooking into the expensive fabric of my tailored suit jacket, trying to forcefully yank me back around to face her. It was a pathetic, desperate bid to reassert physical dominance when all her emotional and financial power had been stripped away. But her fingers barely grazed the silk of my blouse before Renee and two massive corporate security guards materialized from the hallway. They moved with terrifying efficiency. One guard stepped smoothly between us, blocking her path entirely, while the other grabbed her outstretched arms and firmly pinned them to her sides. Brenda thrashed against them, kicking her legs and screaming that I was an ungrateful monster who was destroying the family. Derek had finally stood up from his chair, but he remained frozen on the other side of the mahogany table, too weak and cowardly to intervene. He just watched his wife completely unravel in the middle of my executive suite. I slowly turned around, brushing my shoulder where her fingers had almost touched me. I looked at the frantic, struggling woman being restrained by my security detail. She looked completely unhinged, her face twisted in rage, her hair wild and her designer clothes rumpled. This was the woman who had terrorized my childhood. This was the woman who had made me feel so incredibly small for so many years. I felt a profound sense of liberation watching her finally experience the exact helplessness she had inflicted upon me. "Let her go," I instructed the guards, my voice calm and echoing in the large room. The security guards immediately released her and took a step back, but remained close enough to intercept if she tried to attack again. Brenda stumbled forward, catching her balance. She was breathing heavily, glaring at me with a mixture of intense hatred and absolute terror. She opened her mouth to hurl another venomous insult, but I raised a single hand and silenced her completely. "You do not get to demand anything from me ever again," I said, my words striking her like physical blows. "You spent my whole life making me feel like I was never enough. You ignored my achievements, you belittled my goals, and you threw away my graduation just so you could fiercely protect a son who was absolutely nothing. You enabled his arrogance, and you funded his delusions because you needed a golden child to worship. You sacrificed me on the altar of his ego, and you honestly thought I would just disappear and let you get away with it." I stepped closer to her, invading her space and forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "I am the consequence of every terrible choice you ever made, Mom." I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper. "You built your entire identity around Marcus being better than me. Now Marcus is going to a federal penitentiary, and you are being evicted from your home by the very daughter you threw away. I want you to remember this exact moment when you are packing your boxes. Enjoy the ashes of your golden child." I did not wait for her response. I turned around and walked straight through the heavy oak doors, leaving the boardroom and my toxic family behind me forever. I strode down the glass hallway, my stilettos clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. Renee followed close behind, quietly confirming that the legal team was already initiating the foreclosure protocols. I stepped into the private executive elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors slid shut, I caught one final glimpse of my parents standing defeated in the ruins of their own greed. The high-speed elevator plunged downward, taking me away from the wreckage. I walked across the sprawling lobby, pushed through the revolving glass doors, and stepped out onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath of the crisp, fresh New York air. It was the absolute sweetest breath I had ever taken. I was finally completely free from the suffocating chains of my traumatic past. 6 months passed since that explosive meeting in the boardroom. The wheels of the federal justice system turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. Because the evidence against them was so overwhelming and airtight, neither Marcus nor Chelsea ever saw the inside of a trial courtroom. Their respective defense attorneys took one look at the digital trail, the forged signatures, and the recorded confessions from my boardroom, and immediately advised them to take a plea deal. There was absolutely no defense strategy that could explain away the deliberate interstate transmission of entirely fabricated financial documents to a major private equity firm. The prosecution did not need to build a complex case because Marcus and Chelsea had perfectly gift-wrapped their own federal convictions. The sentencing hearing took place on a cold, overcast Tuesday morning in a federal district court. I did not attend. I had absolutely no desire to witness the final pathetic whimpers of their shattered egos. I simply received a comprehensive summary report from my corporate legal team. According to the court transcripts, Marcus stood before the federal judge and attempted to use his classic charm one final time. He delivered a tearful, completely insincere apology, blaming his actions on the immense pressure of the tech industry and a desperate desire to simply provide for his family. The judge was completely unmoved. He saw right through the narcissistic facade, noting the sheer scale of the deception and the blatant manipulation of his own parents. The judge handed down a sentence of 8 years in a federal penitentiary, followed by 5 years of supervised probation and an order for massive financial restitution. Marcus was immediately remanded into federal custody, his golden child status utterly useless in a cell block. Chelsea's legal strategy was equally disastrous. She continued to aggressively play the victim card, leaning heavily into the narrative that she was a terrified, abused wife forced into signing the documents. But federal prosecutors are not easily fooled by white tears. They presented the judge with the massive email chains Chelsea had personally authored, actively coordinating the loan fraud, and detailing how she planned to spend the illegally obtained money. They showed the court the falsified tax returns she had personally altered. When her wealthy family learned the true staggering depth of her financial crimes and the sheer embarrassment it would bring to their country club reputation, they completely cut her off. They refused to post her bail, and they refused to pay for her high-priced defense attorney. Abandoned by her family and exposed as a willing co-conspirator, Chelsea was sentenced to 4 years in a minimum security federal prison facility. Her leased luxury SUV was repossessed, her designer clothes were auctioned off to pay her creditors, and her elite social status was permanently erased. The empire of lies they had built together was systematically and completely dismantled. The tech startup was officially liquidated by the state, though there was virtually nothing of value left to seize. The original investors filed massive civil suits against Marcus, though they would likely never see a single dime of their money returned. The house of cards had completely collapsed, leaving nothing but a massive crater of debt and destroyed reputations. My parents, of course, did not escape the fallout. After the boardroom confrontation, they returned to Atlanta and were forced to face the horrifying reality of their situation. True to my word, I did not answer their frantic phone calls or respond to their desperate emails begging for forgiveness and a second chance. The 30-day eviction notice stood firm. Without the financial support of their golden child, and with their credit completely ruined by the massive defaulted home equity loan, they had no options left. They spent their final days in the colonial home frantically packing their belongings into rented moving trucks. They were forced to sell most of their furniture and valuables just to afford the deposit on a tiny, cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a much less desirable neighborhood. They lost their prestigious status in their suburban community. They could no longer host their lavish backyard barbecues or brag to their friends about their highly successful tech founder's son. Instead, they became a cautionary tale whispered about at local dinner parties. Brenda spent her days bitterly complaining to anyone who would listen about her cruel, ungrateful daughter, completely ignoring her own massive role in their destruction. Derek sank deeper into his quiet, passive depression, entirely consumed by the crushing weight of his monumental failure as a father and a provider. They were trapped together in their tiny apartment, surrounded by boxes and the bitter ghost of the golden child they had sacrificed everything for. The legal and financial destruction was absolute. The toxic family unit had been completely neutralized, and my empire remained completely untouched. But there was still one final piece of business that needed my attention. What happened to the sprawling 4-bedroom colonial house in Atlanta? I flew back to Atlanta 2 weeks after the 30-day eviction notice officially expired. My corporate legal team had already handled the formal transfer of the deed and secured the entire perimeter of the property. When my private car pulled into the familiar driveway, the sprawling 4-bedroom colonial house looked completely different to me. It no longer looked like an imposing fortress of endless expectations and relentless emotional abuse. It just looked incredibly sad and empty. I used my new set of keys to unlock the heavy front door and walked directly into the main foyer. The house was completely stripped bare of all furniture and decorations. The silence inside the walls was profound and heavy. I walked through the empty rooms, letting my designer stilettos echo sharply against the scuffed hardwood floors. I stood in the massive kitchen where my mother had demanded $50,000 to fund a federal crime. I walked slowly up the main staircase and stood inside the pale blue bedroom that I had always fiercely hated, but was forced to quietly endure. Every single room held a ghost of a cruel comment or a dismissed achievement. The real estate market in that specific affluent suburban neighborhood was incredibly hot. My senior financial advisors back in Manhattan had strongly recommended putting the property up for sale immediately. They projected it would easily sell for over $900,000 in cash to a wealthy family within a single week. It would be a clean, highly profitable end to the entire chaotic ordeal. But as I stood alone in the center of the empty formal dining room, where I had been systematically ignored and belittled for decades, I realized I did not want another family to bring their money here. I did not want to pass this house on to someone else. The walls held far too much misery. The physical foundation of the structure felt soaked in the toxic favoritism that had ultimately destroyed my brother and enabled my parents. Selling it to the highest bidder felt like leaving a cursed monument standing intact. I pulled out my phone and made a single brief call to Renee, my vice president of operations in New York. I told her to immediately cancel all the pending real estate listings and hire the most efficient commercial demolition company in the greater Atlanta area. 3 days later, I stood on the sidewalk directly across the street wearing dark sunglasses and a tailored trench coat. I watched with absolute fascination as a massive yellow excavator rolled onto the perfectly manicured front lawn. The heavy steel claw raised high into the morning air and crashed directly through the roof of the master bedroom. The deafening sound of splintering wood tearing drywall and shattering glass echoed loudly through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Several former neighbors stepped out onto their front porches to watch the violent spectacle in absolute shock. They probably thought the bank was simply clearing the lot for a wealthy modern developer. They had absolutely no idea it was the discarded scapegoat daughter burying her painful past. It took the crew less than 6 hours to completely flatten the massive structure. By sunset, the imposing colonial house was nothing but a massive pile of rubble and splintered wood waiting to be hauled away. I did not leave the lot vacant. Before the demolition crew had even finished clearing the heavy debris, I finalized the extensive legal paperwork for a massive philanthropic transfer. I donated the entire cleared acre of prime suburban real estate to a highly respected local nonprofit organization. It was a charity dedicated exclusively to building advanced community centers and providing full academic scholarships for underprivileged Black girls pursuing higher education in the quantitative sciences. I also fully funded the complete construction of their new state-of-the-art facility on that exact plot of land. I specifically stipulated in the legal contract that the building would remain entirely unnamed. I did not want my corporate name on it, and I certainly did not want my family name anywhere near it. I just wanted it to be a safe, powerful space for young women who were constantly told they were not enough to finally realize they possessed the power to conquer the corporate world. Standing there looking at the freshly leveled dirt, I felt an overwhelming sense of profound absolute peace. The physical manifestation of my childhood trauma was completely gone, effectively erased from the face of the earth. In its place, something deeply beautiful and empowering would soon rise to help girls just like me. My parents had tried to use that specific plot of land to fund a pathetic legacy of lies and greed. I chose to use it to cultivate a lasting legacy of brilliant, independent women. It was the ultimate erasure of their toxic legacy. With the physical destruction of the house complete and the philanthropic foundation laid, I returned to New York City. The flight back felt remarkably different from the desperate escape I had made 5 years earlier. I was no longer a terrified young woman fleeing from emotional abuse and financial manipulation. I was returning home as a conqueror who had permanently neutralized the biggest threat to her peace of mind. The city lights below welcomed me back to the reality I had actively chosen and fiercely protected. But as the plane descended toward the gleaming Manhattan skyline, I realized something profound. True healing is never just about executing the perfect revenge. Revenge is a cold dish that satisfies the ego for a brief moment, but it does not nourish the soul. The satisfaction of watching Marcus get handcuffed or seeing my mother lose her beloved colonial house was undeniable. It balanced the scales of justice. Yet the real victory was not in destroying their lives. The real victory was in the beautiful, untouchable life I had meticulously built for myself out of the ashes of their rejection. I walked into the Apex Holdings office the next morning and looked around at the empire I had created. Renee greeted me at the front desk with a warm, genuine smile, handing me my morning coffee and a briefing file. Julian, my chief analyst, waved from his glass office, already deep into a new portfolio. These people were not just my employees, they were the foundation of my chosen family. We respected each other, we protected each other, and we valued hard work over unearned entitlement. There were no golden children here, and there were no scapegoats. There was only mutual respect and shared success. For 30 years, I had desperately craved the approval of a mother who saw me only as a threat, and a father who saw me only as an inconvenience. I had exhausted myself trying to prove my worth to people who were fundamentally incapable of valuing me. I had believed the toxic lie that blood dictates absolute loyalty. But looking at the incredibly talented, loyal people I had surrounded myself with, I finally understood the truth. Blood simply dictates biology. Loyalty, love, and respect are earned through consistent actions and genuine care. My parents never earned my loyalty, and Marcus certainly never earned my respect. The psychological term for the role I was assigned in my family is the scapegoat. The scapegoat is the person who carries the blame for the toxic family dysfunction, allowing the golden child to remain flawless, and the parents to remain blameless. The only way to win the twisted game of the golden child and the scapegoat is to completely refuse to play. By walking away from that empty graduation auditorium, I had taken away their punching bag. Without me there to absorb their dysfunction, the poison had nowhere to go but inward. They ended up destroying themselves exactly as I knew they would. I sat down at my mahogany desk and looked at the silver nameplate that read, Dr. Chloe Davenport. I had abandoned my family name because it felt like a heavy chain dragging me down into a pit of mediocrity and despair. But now the name Davenport meant something entirely different. It stood for resilience, independence, and absolute corporate power. I had forged this identity in the fires of their betrayal. I had taken the raw, agonizing pain of being unloved and transformed it into a multi-million-dollar private equity firm. I had become a woman who could not be manipulated, bullied, or broken. The profound peace I felt was no longer tied to their punishment. It was tied to my own absolute freedom. I no longer woke up wondering if I was smart enough, pretty enough, or successful enough to finally earn a seat at their table. I had built a much better table, and I was the one deciding who was invited to sit. The heavy burden of their endless expectations was permanently gone, replaced by the limitless potential of my own ambitions. The storm that had raged inside me for decades was finally over, leaving behind a calm, clear horizon. As I looked out the massive glass windows of my office at the bustling city below, I realized my story was not just a personal triumph. It was a blueprint for survival. It was a stark reminder that walking away from toxic bloodlines is not an act of betrayal, but an act of profound self-preservation. I turned away from the window and prepared to speak, knowing there were thousands of people out there carrying the exact same heavy burdens I had just successfully destroyed. I walked across my office and sat down in the leather chair positioned in front of the recording camera. I looked straight into the lens, knowing that behind the glass there was someone sitting in their own childhood bedroom feeling exactly as trapped as I once did. I pressed the record button and took a deep, steadying breath. I want to talk directly to you now, I said, my voice carrying the absolute certainty of a woman who has fought her way through hell and emerged completely untouched. We need to have a very honest conversation about the lies we have been sold regarding family loyalty. For my entire life, I was conditioned to believe family was an unbreakable bond. In our culture, especially as Black women, we are burdened with a very specific and incredibly heavy set of expectations. We are taught from a very young age that we must be the strong ones. We are expected to be the emotional anchors, the financial safety nets, and the silent shock absorbers for every single dysfunction our families create. We are told to endlessly forgive the brothers who steal from us and respect the parents who constantly belittle us simply because we share the same last name. We are actively trained to set ourselves on fire just to keep our relatives warm. If you manage to break the cycle and achieve any level of success, that pressure only intensifies. Suddenly, your hard-earned money is viewed as community property. If you establish boundaries, you are immediately labeled as arrogant or ungrateful. You are accused of forgetting where you came from or thinking you are better than everyone else. But let me be perfectly clear about something. Setting a boundary to protect your peace does not mean you are arrogant. It means you are awake. They tell us that blood is thicker than water, but sometimes blood is just poison. And drinking poison just because it was poured by your mother or your brother will still kill you in the end. You do not owe your success to the people who tried to bury you. Let that sink in. Providing food and shelter is the absolute bare minimum legal requirement of choosing to become a parent. It does not buy them a lifelong all-access pass to your bank account, and it certainly does not give them the right to emotionally abuse you. You do not owe a debt of gratitude to the people who watched you struggle and chose to look the other way. You are allowed to take the success you built with your own two hands and walk completely away from the people who only want to tear it down. Cutting off toxic family members is not a glamorous or easy process. It is incredibly painful. When you finally stop handing over your money and your energy, they will absolutely make you the villain of their story. They will smear your name to the extended family. They will play the victim to anyone who will listen. They will claim they have absolutely no idea why you are acting so cruelly toward them. Let them talk. Let them paint you as the villain. Embrace that role if it means preserving your sanity. Your peace of mind is worth infinitely more than their manipulated version of the truth. It took me 33 years to realize that my mother was never going to love me the way I deserved, and that my brother was never going to respect me as an equal. I spent decades trying to decode the secret formula that would finally make them proud. But the game was rigged from the very beginning. The only winning move was to flip the board and walk away. When I stopped seeking their validation, I unlocked a level of power and focus that allowed me to build an empire. If you are currently sitting in a house where you are treated as an afterthought, I need you to listen to me. Your current environment is not your permanent destination. The people who are trying to dim your light are only doing so because your potential absolutely terrifies them. They know that once you realize your own worth, you will never let them control you again. Do not let them clip your wings just to make them feel comfortable walking on the ground. You possess the power to rewrite the entire trajectory of your life. It requires immense courage and a willingness to be misunderstood by the people you once loved. But the freedom waiting for you on the other side of that difficult choice is beautiful beyond measure. You have to choose yourself because nobody else is going to do it for you. This brings me to the final question. What are you willing to sacrifice today to guarantee your absolute freedom tomorrow? I chose my peace over their comfort, and I can tell you right now, it was the greatest investment I ever made. It yielded daily dividends that no stock market or private equity firm could ever possibly match. When you finally stop pouring your emotional and financial capital into a black hole of familial guilt, you suddenly have all of those valuable resources available to build your own life. You get to keep your energy, you get to keep your joy, you get to keep your hard-earned money, but most importantly, you get to keep your sanity intact. Breaking generational curses is never a passive activity. It requires a ruthless dedication to your own well-being. It requires you to be perfectly fine with playing the villain in their fabricated story, so you can finally be the unapologetic hero in your own. It means looking directly at the people who share your DNA and realizing that your ultimate loyalty must always be to your own future. Now I want to turn this conversation over to you. I want to hear from the people watching this who know exactly what it feels like to be the designated family scapegoat. The ones who were constantly told they were too demanding, or too ambitious, or just fundamentally not good enough to earn basic respect. Have you ever had to walk away from a highly toxic family dynamic just to protect your future? Have you ever had to pack your bags, change your phone number, and completely disappear just to find a single moment of genuine silence? I know exactly how terrifying and isolating that choice can feel in the beginning. When you first make that deep cut, it feels like you are walking through the world completely alone without a safety net. But I promise you that you are not alone. There is an entire silent army of us out here who have walked through that exact same fire and come out completely unburned on the other side. Did you ever get the chance to serve them a massive dose of reality? Did you ever experience that one perfect, crystal clear moment where the tables finally turned and they had to look up at the very person they used to constantly step on? Maybe your moment was not executed in a glass-enclosed Manhattan boardroom. Maybe it was just a quiet firm no delivered across a kitchen table. Maybe it was the day you finally drove away from your hometown and refused to look back in the rearview mirror. Or maybe it was simply the day you decided to stop answering their demanding text messages. Whatever your specific moment of clarity and triumph was, I want to read all about it. Drop your stories in the comments below this video. Let this comment section become a powerful digital testament to our collective survival and strength. Share the exact moment you realized your worth was completely independent of their validation. Detail how you finally stopped funding their endless delusions and started funding your own massive dreams. Reading your lived experiences will help someone else out there find the vital courage they desperately need to finally lock their doors and protect their peace. Your story serves as absolute concrete proof that there is profound happiness waiting on the other side of the endless family guilt trip. It proves that surviving the scapegoat label is just the first step toward building an empire of your own. We are actively building a global community of cycle breakers here. We are proving every single day that you can completely rewrite the pathetic narrative you were handed at birth. If this story resonated with you, if you deeply understand the heavy emotional cost of cutting the cord and the absolute liberation that immediately follows, then hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you firmly believe in taking your power back and building a magnificent table where you are always the guest of honor. Share this video with a friend or a colleague who might be silently struggling with a toxic family dynamic right now. Let them know they have official permission to walk away. Show them they have permission to choose themselves without an ounce of guilt. I will be back very soon with more stories from the boardroom and more high-level strategies for protecting the empire you are building. Keep your head held high and keep your boundaries absolutely impenetrable. Until next time, remember one very crucial thing about dealing with the people who tried to break you. You do not need to waste your precious energy seeking direct vengeance against them. You simply need to outgrow them completely. Because the absolute best revenge is massive, untouchable success. The profound saga of Chloe and her family serves as a masterclass in one of life's most difficult but necessary lessons. Biological ties do not obligate you to endure toxic abuse, and severing those ties is often the ultimate act of self-preservation. For generations, society has pushed the narrative that blood is thicker than water, placing an immense and unfair burden on individuals to endlessly forgive manipulative relatives. Chloe's story violently shatters this illusion, proving that when family loyalty requires you to sacrifice your sanity, your finances, or your dignity, it is no longer love, it is a hostage situation. Through her family's catastrophic downfall, we see the destructive reality of the golden child and scapegoat dynamic. Her parents' blind, enabling devotion to her brother Marcus led them straight into federal crimes and absolute financial ruin. Meanwhile, Chloe, the discarded scapegoat, achieved monumental success precisely because she stopped seeking validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of valuing her. She teaches us that true healing isn't found in petty revenge, but in the radical acceptance that you cannot save people who are entirely committed to their own destruction. Her decision to bulldoze her childhood home and replace it with a philanthropic foundation beautifully illustrates the final phase of this lesson out of the ashes of generational trauma. We have the power to build a magnificent legacy of purpose. Walking away from a toxic bloodline is not a betrayal. It is the vital clearing of emotional debris so that your actual life can take root and flourish. You are allowed to build a table where you are respected, and you are allowed to decide who gets a seat. Evaluate the relationships in your life that consistently drain your spirit and possess the fierce courage to completely walk away from anyone who costs you your peace.